So first I'll introduce myself just a little bit. So my name is Nathan Fisher. I organize with a group called Jacobin Los Angeles, which is a Marxist discussion group, predominantly semi-affiliated with the publication Jacobin, if anyone is familiar with that. It's published quarterly out of Brooklyn. We do meet on the east side. Obviously, I'm here to shill that a little bit, so if you're interested at all in that, reach out to me, put you on the email list. We actually meet tomorrow. We meet monthly. Anyway, thanks to Andrea for having me here. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Bolshevik Revolution, which is a large historical event, but in its historical implications and in its sort of ideological overtones, it's a scary event for a lot of people to approach. There are a lot of conceptions and misconceptions about it, and it's something that most people, I don't think, are terribly familiar with in any sort of detail. Again, it's a huge thing, and I didn't know exactly where to start. I didn't know exactly what we really wanted to focus on, but Andrea said that I should talk about what is a Soviet? The Bolshevik Revolution brings into being something called the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. What does that word mean? A Soviet is a type of council, which is where the connection with the work you're doing here is going to become apparent. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a Soviet, where does it come from, how did this organization come to be the executive power of an entire country, and also what are the implications of that in our political project moving forward and how we organize. So to start, you sort of have to start with the context of what is happening. We are about to approach the 100th anniversary. We are here on the 99th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Next year, there will be big parades and heavy denunciations. You have to remember that Russia at this time in 1917 is engaged in, there's something very bad happening in 1917, for those of you who do not know. There's a giant war happening. And Russia is in it. It has been thrust into it by the political regime as it exists, which is the Tsar, in order to sort of recapture what is basically like a crumbling state that is not going to last very long, and the war is extremely unpopular. People are dying en masse. There are mass famines in the country. These are not the conditions where one would be inclined to support the ruling regime. These would be conditions where one is, heavily dissatisfied, to say the very least. Because of this, in February 1917, before we get to October, which is where everything gets really exciting, in February, this is where the Tsar abdicates. The Tsar leaves. And the country is put in the hands of what is a provisional government, which is essentially a government of liberals and socialists who claim we're now going to be the power. We're going to democratize everything. In some cases, pass freedom of the press, and these sort of like these things that are typically considered like freedoms in a democracy. And we're going to convene a constituent assembly at the end of the year, and then we'll have like a real government. So at the same time that this happens, what you see are Soviets come into existence. Now I'm going to actually answer what is a Soviet. So a Soviet is a council. It is not only for workers. In other words, there are workers' Soviets, but there are also soldiers' Soviets, there are peasants' Soviets. What these are bodies that are meant to create an executive power that rests only in the hands of the working class, essentially. They are distinct from trade unions or from cooperatives in this way. There are trade unions in Russia at this time. They are distinct from a Soviet. A trade union would, for example, keep standards on wages and conditions in an industry, a prevailing industry. There are also factory shop committees, which would be sort of what we would expect to see on sort of what we're talking about, like a co-op on like a very individual basis, on like an individual firm. Factory shop committees would decide the labor process and how it is organized and who is task management and things like this. The Soviet is different. The Soviet is designed relatively intentionally to challenge the executive authority of the government itself, of the state. It is essentially creating the apparatus of a state in competition with the actual government of Russia. So essentially, the way it works, or the way it worked in Russia in 1917, of course, is there are Soviets in each sort of region or location. The revolution will eventually be kicked off in the capital of Russia at the time, which is Petrograd, and it will eventually hand power to the Petrograd Soviet. But throughout Russia, there are different Soviets in different regions. These are like county Soviets, basically. You can think of it, it's very similar in concept to any sort of like representative democratic structure, where people, vote on the basis of parties, not candidates, who goes to their district Soviet. The district Soviet then elects people to the all-Russian, Soviet, who elects people to the Central Committee of the Soviet. There's a whole series of, in a very similar way that here, we might be members of our local party who send people to the county party, who then get to the national party, and then they become the leadership of the party. But what's really important to recognize here is that it's exclusively for workers. It's exclusively meant to basically pass binding regulations on what is and is not permitted on the level of production. And the way it does this is also a relatively important point that we have to remember because we are in the midst of World War I, is that there are soldiers, Soviets as well. Because we have a situation where the government of Russia wants people to keep fighting and to advance against the German army, and most soldiers are like, I really don't really feel like doing this anymore. We've been dying en masse for a long time. I think we should maybe have an alternative body to make these decisions. Really, when we get to the Bolshevik Revolution, what we are really talking about is making manifest the common claim, you and whose army, basically, is what we're talking about. It's basically who actually has the control. So that's essentially what a Soviet is. And certain soldiers and worker Soviets then can combine forces, essentially. And if you have the support, we are talking about people basically defecting en masse from the legitimacy of the state government and saying we prefer these workers' bodies, to pass legislation and such things. Eventually we'll. Okay, so that's kind of what a Soviet is. In Russia at the time, Russia is fighting a war that it is not winning. The provisional government, which is a government of liberals and socialists, wants to essentially continue the war. There's one party that does not want to continue the war. This is the Bolshevik party. This is the big scary party that we all kind of know about. The Bolshevik party decides that instead of continuing the war, what should happen is that all power in the country should be ceded voluntarily to the Soviets. And in other words, we already have this great mechanism. The workers have voted all these people, through the process of direct democracy, into an all-Russian, Council of Soviets. We like them a lot more than we like the provisional government who, is trying to send us into war and country's falling apart. We just think they should be in charge, essentially. This is considered a very aggressive ploy by the Bolshevik Party. Almost everyone is against this decision. They think that it will drive the country into civil war, that the Germans will basically advance and advance onto into the Russian capital, and chaos will reign. But this is the point to which the Bolshevik Party is attempting to reach. This is the end game of their strategy. And if we want, we can get into exactly what occurs on a day-to-day basis during a revolutionary process. But what essentially happens is you build up, is the strategy is you have to build up that idea of dual power, which is essentially when Richard Wolff is a Marxist, if an erratic one. But what Marx does, understand, and what you all understand, is that when workers come together and form organizations, they have a power that is unique to them as members of the working class. In other words, because of their structural position within a certain class relationship, if they withdraw their labor power, or if they organize in very specific ways, they can sort of collapse the system entirely. They can bring it to a halt in ways that other people, like in the case of Russia, like the peasantry, are simply unable to do. So they would not have those sort of like catastrophic effects on the reproduction of a specific political system. So what the Bolshevik Party's strategy is, and what the idea of the Soviets is, it's to create a body that, through workers' organization, already has the capacity to execute the functions of the state and the economy. We sort of talk about this like on a very minor level. What you're talking about in a firm is essentially if workers organize, they don't need bosses. And we don't need bosses. People say, what would you do without the boss? You go to work, you do the same thing you always did. Literally don't need them. What you're trying to do then is build that beyond an individual basis to an entire political apparatus that says not only do we not need the boss, we actually don't need the government. That the whole political structure that we are subjected to is literally unnecessary. It is rendered redundant. It's incapacitated. It can't do anything. This happens in failed states all the time, but usually what it yields is mass chaos. So there are several states, for example, now, that have competing governments, that have, that cannot control their territorial boundaries. Like, this is what civil war is. But generally, there's nothing there to take its place, so it simply falls. Libya, for example, right now has literally 4 competing governments. Who is in control of Libya? It depends where you are. So in Bolshevik Russia, just in Russia, in October 1917, the Bolshevik Party finally decides that it is going to basically take the lead. And it does this literally by decree. It says the governing authority, sole executive power in the entire Russian state is now in the hands of the Petrograd Workers and Soldiers Soviet. It doesn't say the Bolshevik Party, it doesn't say it's in the hands of Vladimir Lenin. It says it is in the hands of the Petrograd Workers and Soldiers Soviet. That's it. It's all us. Now, the first thing that happens here is the government says, as you would expect, actually they're not in power, we're still in power. And you have literally like a war of words where people are like saying, nah, I'm actually in charge, or I'm actually in charge. And this is where the question, you and whose army comes literally into play. Because what essentially happens is, we're talking about a capital of Russia where there are tens of thousands of soldiers are garrisoned there for the war. And they have to take sides, basically. If we're talking about a political project, what you are really building is a project that you can get most people to your side on. Because there will come a moment where they have to, essentially choose one side or the other. So they choose the Bolsheviks. If we want, we can get to the very, very specifically what happens on a day-by-day basis here. But for the sake of what's happening, the Bolsheviks have power. The Soviets, there's a workers' state in Russia. So, I said I would talk a little bit about what happens, what does this power look like, and what happens after the revolution, because most of us know that the Russian Revolution did not actually end with a thriving workers' state. So what happens in this sort of interim, or what does it look like in that transition phase? What it looks like in Russia is a party that, from the moment it takes power, has to consolidate that power under threat of physical extinction, essentially. The Bolshevik Party is at war, both against military counter-revolutionaries at home who are trying to overthrow the Bolshevik government, and it's still at war with Germany. So it has to sign a peace treaty with Germany. This creates a not terribly thrilled reaction from their current allies in the Entente, who then station troops in Russia in order to prevent, essentially, the Eastern Front from collapsing. And what you're really faced with is, how does a party and how does a state function when it's thrust into power with essentially no plan and no support? This is an argument that is often thrown, to reduce like the same types of arguments to sort of what we're talking about now on a very like smaller basis. You're often asked, I'm sure, if you say we want to organize like this firm ourselves, especially if it's a firm that's larger than like a handful of people, how can you possibly expect to do that? The implication being that you could never be organized or intelligent enough to solve these types of problems. So what we see in the history of this project is really an experimentation. These things happen by necessity. The organization of the Bolshevik Party becomes centralized very quickly around what they elect as a government of commissars, basically. So you have the Central Executive Committee of the Bolshevik Party. They say, we want this guy in charge of this guy in charge of that. And power does very quickly pass into their hands sort of exclusively, and they have to figure out basically how to keep the country running. I don't want to take like a super historical detour, so I kind of just want to talk about what can we learn from this project today, and what is its relationship to movement building. And I think that what we have to understand is that the Soviet model is about a form of economic organization and a form of political organization. And that is the link that we have to make, in that we are sort of constantly evading in questions about how to organize the workplace. Because how to organize a workplace and how to organize a state are two different things. And the impulse to democratize one while democratizing the other can actually run into conflict. So this is something that I was thinking about when we were raising it. We were all talking about worker co-ops. It's one thing to spread the gospel on how we should have more democratic workplaces, and how everyone can actually have like a more fulfilling life, and we don't exploit as many people if we organize our firms in such and such a way. But the question is raised, how do these things become organized as like a unitary force that can displace what is a state which realistically, when push comes to shove, is designed to inhibit your ability to do that? There are obstacles that you will run into as you try to turn things into co-ops, or as you try to unionize. And what needs to occur in order to overcome those obstacles? And one of the projects of Soviet Russia is essentially to say that the sole political power should lie in this specific organization of the working class. But that's a huge leap, because we here in this room are talking about how to organize individual economic firms, but we're not talking about how to turn that into a political project. That's sort of what I want to talk about. I'm sort of hesitant to keep talking right now, because I want to figure out if this makes any sense at all, if anyone wants to talk about anything else, and get some feedback here. But the question remains, how does the working class constitute itself as a class project, both on the level of the workplace, and on the level that it can actually challenge the state? And my belief, there's sort of two strategies, right? One is that we elect friendly candidates who will eventually become a sort of hegemonic force in the government. This is the strategy of Bernie Sanders and others, where we'll focus on down ballot races. Essentially, this is the idea that, hey, we live in a representative democracy, and we're going to use the plurocratic system to vote for people that we like, and then eventually they're going to pass friendly policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is a strategy, and I'm not trying to say it's not a strategy. But there is an alternative strategy, which is that you create, through organized labor power, a force that is capable of challenging the legitimacy of the state and saying that it is able to function without it, to incapacitate the state, to make it so that it is literally unnecessary or an actual hindrance to the development of this alternative body. I mean, this is the idea of, people have thought of the idea of a labor party in this country before. It didn't go very far, sadly, but at times even at times in this country when unions have been strong, they've been able to make claims on the government in order to force concessions that otherwise would not have occurred. I mean, to me, the project is building that back up. It becomes built back up through solidarity, through exactly kind of what we're talking about here, which is there are alternative forms of organizing society and of organizing a workplace, and those don't have to be isolated instances that will sort of small bit by bit change the molecular composition of labor in this country. They can be actually unified, and when they are unified, there is an immanent power within them. Everyone should know that as a worker at a workplace, you do have power. There's certain types of power that you don't have, that you would rather have, but every working class person who unites with another working class person against their boss has power that the boss doesn't have. And if that can be, contemplated and concretized, you can create a political force, which is something that, we should be trying to make. And that's essentially what happens in Bolshevik Russia, to go back to what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is, you essentially, the goal is to make the government superfluous. That's the idea. And that can be done either working through the channels of electoral democracy, or it can be done through organizing on our own right. And I think the emphasis should be on organizing ourselves and the power that's vested within us. And I kind of want to hold this up because I'm feeling very nervous to run this room. Yeah, go for it.
Cool. I just want to.
Whoever.
John. Okay. Well, I have just three things I wanted to kind of help clarify. I should say I'm a Trotskyist, and so is my father, so we have a particular view of the Soviet Union. We have to remember three things. One, Russia was a feudal state. It's completely different to like the capitalist state we live in. And it sounds like it's just a word difference, but like the entire way that the entire country was set up, like economically institutionalized, was different. So when Lenin and Trotsky took over, they were trying to, what Marx says is the way you get socialism, it comes after capitalism. So there's this whole period during the Civil War and after where they're going through something called state capitalism. So we have to remember that they realized that there was this like gap. So they were trying to rush their way to a point where they could go on to socialism. Secondly, the way that the Bolsheviks, most of the people in Russia were sympathetic to socialism at this point, different forms of socialism, the Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, and beyond. You have to remember that the liberals who were sharing power at this time, were mostly in the cities. They were like people out here in Santa Monica, not like, people out in like, Carson or Inglewood or Hawthorne, where actually the majority of people like in Los Angeles County live. Also, the Soviets themselves actually have a longer history, and they're rooted in the 1905 uprising, which took place. The Petrograd Soviet actually came into existence in 1905. That's where Trotsky became famous. So the thing is, when the February Revolution happened and they came into power, they still were going to honor their obligations to the Allies and fight in this imperialist war that no one in Russia wanted to fight in. And they kept doing it, and people kept on dying. And at a certain point, there was that's how the Bolsheviks were able to get power, because they were the only ones calling for peace. Poland had not been a country for 200 years, but Lenin said, "I'm willing to give Poland up and all these other countries just so there's peace." What did Poland do in exchange? They invaded Russia. Same with us. We invaded Russia. No one talks about this. We invaded Russia. British invaded Russia. The Japanese invaded Russia. There was 31 armies, including the White armies, and that's what leads to the Civil War. So.
I just want to respond to one thing that I read there, not as a direct response, but there is sort of also an implication. The point is raised that the transition from feudalism to socialism is the debate at the time is whether or not this transition is actually feasible, whether or not the Bolshevik Revolution is sort of pushing too hard on the gas pedal, and this is where the resistance lies. We have to remember, now that the point is raised, I'm going to bring it up. This is a revolution made in the name of Marxism. So the dogmatic sort of Marxist debates are actually animating this revolution as it's happening. Marxism now seems to be the last thing on a lot of people's minds. But at the time, this is a workers' government that is doing this in the name of like a very sort of specific body of work. And yes, the huge debate at the time, the reason the Bolsheviks are unpopular and that their main opposition is basically every other socialist party, who still claims to be a Marxist party, is that, yes, the conditions that were prevailing in 1917 were not sufficiently developed in order for a successful passage into a socialist economy. Basically for the reasons just described, that the mass of the country is agrarian, that it still is under feudal relations, that essentially we need to let capitalism do some more work here before we make the transition into socialism. That it's essentially underdeveloped and it's a lost cause. And most people say they say the Bolsheviks, let them take power, they're going to fall from power in like 5 days because like they're not going to have anything to do. It brings a very specific question up, which is the timing of a political event necessary to know beforehand? Do we need to, in other words, wait for the conditions to ripen enough that we choose to make a political move or choose a certain political tactic? I am of the tendency that we should not assume that history will make our choices for us. That, in other words, the act of politics is in fact to create the conditions that you want to exist and to seize them when you have the opportunity. You hear some, I guess, variation of this argument today, generally as told by the U.S. to other countries, which when they're trying to democratize them, they need time, essentially under the stewardship of American personnel prior to them being able to flourish as fully, autonomous sovereign nations. I tend to think that time is unnecessary. Though, anyway, you were going to say.
Can you give me 3 reasons how this revolution worked, where it was successful, and then 3 ways it failed?
3 ways it was successful and 3 ways it failed. No, it was clear.
Like, where was it successful, and then where did it fail, or if it indeed did?
Yeah. Okay. So the revolution succeeds in a couple of very specific ways. It depends what your gauge of success is here. It does pass. The government is in the hands of working people. That is a success. It's a pretty definition of success. Working people vote for bodies. Their political party is in power. There is workers' control of industrial production. There is an end to. There's a literal end to exploitation. The bourgeoisie is, employers.
That's probably questionable, though.
What is questionable?
In terms of whether the workers actually had, and which workers had power, or whether the party had power.
I would argue that.
There's a matter of consciousness of the working class, and you think about workers in a factory here, and what their mindset is in terms of the daily existence, and you think, well, wouldn't it be nice if we're proposing that workers control the factory and have meetings to decide all that stuff.
That'd be great.
If you go back and look at that really didn't happen to the large extent that you would hope that it would have had.
I would say you can argue that it deteriorates in a year's time.
I would argue that it never actually materialized. That there were some aspects.
In 1917,
there were some aspects of it, and there's certainly there's certainly a movement, but it wasn't as ripe as you would think, and might have been in a country that was more developed, like Germany or the United States.
I think that the timeline that you're drawing is a little too dire. In the winter of 1917 and in the spring of 1918, the Bolshevik Party isn't even in control of most of the country. It's still in the hands of Soviets, but what you're talking about, centralized control in the hands of only the Bolshevik Party, doesn't happen. The Bolshevik Party is a minority party throughout the country at that point, or at least it doesn't have the apparatus that would be necessary to maintain the level of strict control that it would like. It convened, of course, like the classic example is it convenes the Constituent Assembly in December, pending that it approves the Soviet government. The Constituent Assembly says, we don't like the Soviet government disbands it after a day. So, in that, yes, there is a very specific political project that the Bolshevik Party does, seize, sole party control. But until that happens, I would argue that, we also have to remember that we're talking about, there are conditions in the capital, in Petrograd, where the Bolsheviks are centralized and do have mostly maintained control of the city. And then there's the rest of Russia, which is really realistically has to be governing autonomously on a regional level for quite a while. Until, yes, we really want to talk about if we want to talk about explicitly when does the transition occur to sole party control, where the Bolshevik Party does seize the levers of basically all legitimate power and start to repress their opponents, which does happen. It happens, I think, later than you're giving it credit for. But yeah, all right. Were you saying anything? Yeah.
2 more successes and 2 more failures.
Yeah, 2 more successes, 2 more failures. It's. I don't know how to pinpoint explicit successes. Or specific failures. There
was universal health care.
Oh yeah, of course. Oh yeah, on this level,
that kind of thing,
Yeah. Bolshevik Russia in 1917 is the first country on earth to have free and legal abortion on demand.
Right.
It's a very specific, yes.
Right. Those are the things that I would think that he would be saying. What kinds of things?
When they went from a feudal state to one of the first power in terms of they were.
I was just there are people who would maintain that its existence is a success. That literally, if you look at the types of states that preceded it, or attempted failed revolutions that preceded it, the most famous is the direct example that Lenin and Marx are looking at is the Paris Commune, which I won't get into, but which is a workers-controlled government in Paris that lasts not very long. I don't know exactly how many days. Do you know how many days? 80 days?
Was it that much?
Yeah,
It was 60. It was closer to 2 months.
Yeah, okay, 60 days. And in fact, Lenin, in his journal, I forget the exact date. If it's the 61st day, he would write "commune +1." In other words, the state does actually, until 1991, existed. That itself is sort of an achievement, proof that political power can be passed in the hands of the working class and it won't be crumbled instantly. I don't remember her name, but it's correct that the Bolshevik government is promptly invaded by the Entente powers and by its neighboring countries to the east, and that it's racked by a civil war. So, and then it does sufficiently industrialize and mobilize to the point that it's able to, literally win World War II. So, it's a matter of, on that level, as a level of functioning state, it's a huge success. But,
What was failing?
What were its failings?
If any.
You do say that it built up to the point that it could combat fascism.
Yeah.
But the question is, at that point, was it a socialist state? Was it a work? No, I'll take that even further. And was it a workers-controlled state, where it was representative down to the worker factory floors. And
I would
think
say
you find-
no
you
to
find
that. That's a
probably
very
not.
specific definition. But I would say no to that. Of course, it wasn't a directly democratically controlled worker state down to the factory floor. But this raises a question. I mean, this is a tricky thing because this is what we're talking about, right? It's like there is actually a contradiction between allowing every workplace down to every member of the factory floor, controlling that, and yet simultaneously being able to, have a political project that is unified and that can move in the directions that we're talking about here. I mean, this is like sort of outside the scope.
I just want to add a point to Nathan. I think the idea of freedom in the workplace in Soviet Union was not existing. They were 5 years planned. So for 5 years, the money were invested in a specific part of the economy. So the control also in the university. So we need X amount of engineering to build the country. That's a huge contradiction. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But there is a balance in my view.
I mean, there's the contradiction, and Lenin identifies this contradiction even in the, I'll get you, I'll say, even like, right when the Bolsheviks are seizing power. I mean, there is a contradiction between industrial freedom at the level of a specific factory or a specific point of production and being able to manage, sort of a entire nation state in the direction that would be, a sort of, there's a, sorry, I'm trying to find the words for this. There's a contradiction on the level of an individual producer and a aggregate consumer, essentially. Like, you need certain things for the country to run. I mean, the first thing that the Soviets run into is we don't have enough food. We need food. And so they go to the countryside and they say, we need basically all of this food. And of course, there's resistance. There are certain, this is like one of the things that leads to the Civil War, where they say, we don't really want to give you the food. And they say, well, I'm sorry, this is like, it's our way or the highway, basically. And this is where the beginnings of state repression, the beginning of these things happen. But there is a contradiction between the idea of central state planning and individual workplace freedom. That's a contradiction we have to work out, but theoretically as Marxists and of course pragmatically on the ground when we're building political projects. I mean, I would argue that there's nothing within simply the idea of a worker self-directed commune that would be in contradiction to capitalism. I would argue that in fact, it seems like if we really believe that the basis, the absolute foundation of our political framework is that each firm should be able to collectively make the decisions that it wants to, that doesn't necessitate a political alternative to capitalism.
Right. I agree with you that Mondragon has grown and it's developed and is huge, and it's coexisting in a capitalist society. And in my view, it's part of the puzzle. And part of my dealing with listening to Rick Wolff is how does that model fit into a socialist model where you're actually controlling the government and beyond, and that's kind of my thought process. Still trying to get my head around is how do you get to that point, and is the model of the Soviet Union, it's an imperfect model too, so you have to look at what it did and what it's
totally. I mean, we can argue about it as an imperfect model for sure in terms of how it governed as a state, but what it was successful at was building up what we're talking about, disparate types of economic organizations, and forging them into a political instrument that was capable of challenging a state power. I mean, that was successful. It literally created, worker-controlled bodies that were capable and had the, power and backing to it became the sole power of the state. It might not have used that power in the ways that it wanted to, or that we can. I mean, it's a lot of history we can go over and argue about forever, but it's successful in that specific way for sure. Go for it.
Just as a theoretical question, do you feel like having a organization of labor to the point where the government itself is actually superfluous,
Right.
it's always a good thing? Or if it is a good thing, because then there are certain things, like how do you set national policies on anything at that point, right? Like,
Well, I mean, the national policies are set by these, like, by the workers' body. It becomes the governing body.
Okay.
It simply displaces the democratic forms of that, or not democratic forms. That would be an assumption. There are certainly places that are not democratic. It simply displaces the political body as such. I mean, what we're talking about. To answer that theoretical point with like a theoretical answer, it's like, Lenin describes the state as essentially the purpose of the state is to recreate and reproduce like class relations. It keeps classes as they are, and the state, insofar as it exists, represents the absolute irreconcilable antagonism of those classes, right? So when you have like these bodies, in this case, like to use the example of the Soviet Union, not that you have to organize on exactly that type, but you have some sort of like workers' movement, some sort of body that then takes over or destroys the state, renders it redundancy. You no longer have the state as such. You have like authority. You have authorities. You have bodies that are making political decisions.
That are made by workers.
Yeah, but you don't have.
If you're not in the worker class, what happens to you?
You don't get a voice. Typically.
Right.
The point in the
Right.
the point in the ideal state is that you don't have a police force that is
You have worker control militias.
or an army that's going to repress you when you have grievances.
Right.
Right. Unfortunately, I need to leave.
No. I mean, this is actually a compelling point, because it is important to recognize that the Bolshevik Party claims explicitly to not speak for a democratic state.
Thanks, guys.
Right.
In other words, it says, Lenin says that democracy is necessary for the political state only, and that he's not looking, for a political state. He's looking for literally a workers' government. If you're a member of like the bourgeoisie, and
But you don't have to be a member of the bourgeoisie, right? You're a member of the peasants.
This kind of starts the Civil War, but yeah.
Well, they're not workers either, right?
No, but they're allied. So to answer that question, there are peasant Soviets in the Soviet Union that are allied during the actual event of the revolution with the Bolshevik Party. That after the time, I mean, this is like the complications that lead to like war and repression and like horrible things happening in the Soviet Union are that relationship between the industrial working class in the center of the city and the agrarian populace on the outside. And that relationship is incredibly tricky. I mean, it's a relationship that I don't want to like simplify or reduce, but it's like still something that like we sort of have today in terms of like what is the relationship between industrial centers of the world and basically just mass, reserve labor pools with like resources.
Well, you can look at the U.S., right?
Yeah. I mean, the answer in the Soviet Union is that the peasants have their own Soviets, who then control the land. The land question, they appropriate land, they give it, they have collective farms. It's this mass project of collectivization, but this leads to like, I mean, I don't want to get on this wormhole, but it leads to world.
There's a question.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? To kind of sum up what I would view of what we've been talking about is when the Soviets basically, we have to remember, this was a failed experiment, but in many ways it has created our modern world and has done many good things for the world. Like, without the Soviet Union existing, there couldn't be other revolutions, such as in Cuba. We would have gone and crushed them. Smallpox wouldn't have been eliminated because, it was us, the United States, who said only wealthy countries who can afford it will give the thing to. And the Soviet Union's like, no, we're going to go through the United Nations. We're going to get rid of it everywhere where people can't afford it. And we have to remember, when Lenin and Trotsky took over, they were going to try to push and spread the revolution around the world. Marx says it has to be workers of the world unite. It can't be in one country. So when they were kind of boxed into their area, you can say theoretically it failed then. Still, even with Stalin, but let me just say I'm a Trotskyist. I'd be purged under Stalin. So we like to say he's like this horrible guy like Hitler. Not really. He industrialized the country. He found it with the wheelbarrow and left it with the nuclear bomb. 20 million. He defeated Hitler. We didn't defeat Hitler. He defeated Hitler. 20 million Soviet citizens were killed, and 10 years later they were in space. That's the thing, like, this revolution, there is so much to learn from it and everything, but you know, our government paints it as just bad. Don't learn about it, don't read anything about it. But look, it's done all this good for the world. If not, we would have just gone up. We would literally, if they had not exist, we'd be doing what we do now to like the Middle East and all these other countries, but we would have done it for a century.
If I can answer to your question, or if you're interested, but I have some friends that was born in Soviet Union, and I think at some point one of the main problem where they failed was their ability to predict what was going to happen in the future. The real socialist was not attractive anymore. So when you had this happened probably in 1988, 1989, where you were comparing so the model system what was coming from so the West and Western Europe to what was your daily life. Like, he told me a Western story in Soviet Union when you go to shop, there was $1. Were not 10,000. Okay, and this is of course creates aspects. So there are a lot of nice documentaries about the German reunification after the failure of the Berlin Wall, where they were comparing so the two lifestyle of the two people that were basically from the same genetic pool, that were separated 50, 45 years before. And they were really, really different. They were living really different lives. So where you expect to live with a precise healthcare system, everything was provided, abortion was free, healthcare university was free, everything was, you have everything organized at work. While at some point this model was not attractive anymore. I don't know what is the reason why it was attractive. Not because it's not right, because I strongly believe it's the right model, but was not attractive anymore because people were starting to compare so the freedom that was coming from the Western Europe to the type of freedom they had. And I think I was discussing with Andrea last week. I think they come up a different concept of freedom, which is probably what makes really the countries different. There was political freedom to express yourself in a country where you had access to universal health care, free university, the very good health system like in Cuba, where they don't have what we call the political freedom. I think I spent the entire my youth, last 15 years, trying to understand which one is the weight you need to assign to this type of freedoms that contradict themselves sometimes. I never still not able to answer that questions. I think they contradict the huge problem the Soviet Union was born at some point when the world was changing, after especially, so we had a very strong political movements back in the 70s in Europe, all across Europe. So Germany, in Italy, in Ireland, in England, so where revolutionary left organization, they were really attacking the power. But at some point there was a decline, and of course there was imposing of different model systems. So people were thinking that freedom was something different. And the bloc Soviet Union before and then East Germany was not able to anymore to follow this kind of ideas. And I think there was a big failure on that stage, but I'm not sure. But that's my personal opinion.
I can answer that real quickly. I want to respond to that real quickly. Because you're absolutely right. This happens. People will always be attracted to rich West countries. This is just a fact of life. Like, for all the talk of people fleeing, East Germany or fleeing Cuba from Miami, first of all, it never compares to the amount of people who are fleeing places in the Middle East that have been decimated by Western powers and are trying to get out of what is a horrible situation. But you're raising the point, which is he raised as well, which is that hey, there is a tendency, if you realize it, for socialism to catch on in really poor, immiserated rural countries. There's a reason for that, which is that people who are constantly faced with the day-to-day, basically abysmal life chances that they have, reach for a system and a model that is going to like radically redefine and reconstitute that. And so people always, the West will always be attractive because it is. I mean, capitalism will always be attractive because it's able to like produce like a lot of things. Of course, it comes with a huge undertow that like we do not see in like the periphery of this globe that is part and parcel of it, and that it cannot ever separate itself from. It can only like obscure into deeper corners of the earth that we will never go and see. But there is a tendency, of course, for socialism to. I mean, there's a contradiction wherein, while the argument theoretically would be that it's actually developed countries that would be easier to convert to socialism because they have the material basis and the economic basis, it is in fact in the periphery where we find most often the most active socialist movements. I mean, that's kind of a contradiction, but it's not really. Richer countries would be easier to socialize. It's, we already, America, we already have like, the conceptually socializing America would be like very simple. We have like a lot of goods, we have a lot of money, like we have everything we need. But because it's positioned against these sort of like backwards countries, it's also simultaneously the most difficult to like build that up as a political project. I mean, there's a time where like a third of the world's landmass is socialist in the 50s, but it's happening in like China and another rural agrarian revolution. So there is something to be said for like, here we are in the heart of like, capitalist, literally the heart of the sole world power, like the true champion of capitalism. Where it's going to be like the hardest pitch, I don't know how to solve that problem yet.
I think there was a question over here.
Yeah. So it sounds like from much of the discussion I've been privy to here, that the failing point for the Bolshevik Revolution, if there is a point that you refer to as that, would be when the Bolshevik Party kind of started to marginalize others and use their weight and influence to accumulate power within the Soviet structure. Is that?
I think that is a fair argument. I mean, for a variety of reasons, I'm loath to go down win to the Soviet Union, betray the working class. If only because, like, what I think is important to learn from. I mean, I think it's interesting historically, but I mean, it's also something that is the start of much debate. What I think is important is not so much, there's a reason after 1917 we don't really talk of Marxism, and then we talk of Marxist-Leninism for the next 100 years, and that is the language through which we interpret Marxism, because it was the successful model of a working class revolution, for better or for worse. And there are people who will say, this is the playbook that we have to follow, that this can be replicated. I don't think that is a very important, necessarily important as a question. I think instead of saying, did Lenin do this right or did Lenin do this wrong at any given moment in time, we should ask, was Lenin correct at understanding the implications of his actions? Was he interpreting the problems correctly? He might have fucked up once or twice, but he understood the stakes that he was, the stakes of the game that he was playing. And theoretically, at least, I think that model still holds. He was trying to defend the integrity of a state that was under siege, essentially. And yes, they do consolidate. There are people who, I mean, the classic, anything can be defended or rationalized in a way if you say the alternative is like complete collapse, right? Yeah. And I mean, this is why this debate is so like heated, because people are like, well, yes, the alternative is it ceases to exist, as it does now. Yeah. For those of you, its successes and its failures, I mean, after 1991, life expectancies in Russia collapsed. They collapsed at a period that is never really been seen in contemporary history, where because of these programs that, yes, in some ways a strict that doesn't afford certain types of freedoms, which again, the Bolshevik Revolution and socialism and Marxism as a project is about not muddying, but being a little bit more precise by the contradictions that are inherent in ideas like democracy. individual and collective democracy are not compatible forms. They just simply aren't. Or freedom. Freedom is a language through which we frame our project that may, in fact, inhibit as much as it, unleashes potentialities. So, the collapse of the Soviet Union leads to catastrophic circumstances for the people who live there. At the same time, does it free us now to create some sort of left-wing project without that as casting a shadow over the entire international movement? Those are very tricky things.
Well, I guess you would want to identify it at the point that I mentioned, rather than, of course, I don't know where this would be, but when the
eventually the Bolshevik Party it becomes the Communist Party, becomes the only legal political party in the Soviet Union. So some people would say that's the point.
Okay. But I mean, the only reason that that they were able to repress workers or oppress workers in once becoming that sole party is because they acquired this power earlier in the entire chain of causality, right? So
I don't know if I would necessarily agree that it's quite so clear cut like the concept.
I'm sure it's not.
If only because I think that then we fall into this trap where, the horrible outcomes of the Soviet Union can be identified in the theories of Marxism itself. You know what I mean? Like, this is like an argument that people will say that. We are talking about a party that sets as its goal the complete repression of like all other classes besides the working class, and it runs up immediately into the enormity of the difficulties of that situation, the contradictions that arise from it. One of them is that it still exists in like a capitalist world, that it can't, as it's reminded of daily by the armies that are literally, in its territory. And, famously, the Bolsheviks attempt from like 1917 to 1920 to basically outlaw like all forms of like private trade, and with the goal to being like we don't need money except as like maybe an accounting measure, and this goes like disastrously. This is like one of the key reasons where like the country's almost going to fall apart because of this. And so Lenin backtracks. He's like, okay, we're going to allow some private trade. We're going to get like some there are people who will say that like those introductions of like market mechanisms like saved the country for a period of time. So it's a very like halting beast, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't think there's any outcomes.
They didn't really have an alternative. Like, how were you going to gauge what people needed unless there was a market? Like, that was what the market was for. It was like the means, the mechanism that existed, right, to deliver goods and services to people. Right. And when when the state tried to take that away and substitute it with something else, they couldn't really gauge what people needed.
In some ways, I don't think the market necessarily mediates what people need. There's one argument for the market, but
that's the main argument for the market.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good one, but it's like that's
no,
what
it allows at a time when not to make the economic argument, but at a time when the Soviet Union is like starved for cash, both because like foreign channels of credit are being cut off, and therefore the money that you want to like basically pay for good, you're setting fixed costs on everything, but this money is valueless. No one is willing to do it. You have this same situation, like the economic boundaries of action are like present today in countries in like Latin America, where it's you can only do so much when your currency is being driven into the ground by essentially like economic warfare.
Like Venezuela.
Yeah, like in Venezuela, where like you can set state prices so that things are affordable, and yet because it's just an inflationary spiral, you're not able to actually exchange them the way you would, because there's a political, and so then the only thing you can is seize things from people, and that leads to people don't like it very much, and it's.
I just want to kind of clarify what we meant, like democracy and everything. We live in a democracy, but then none of our views really influence the government at all. Really, what we live in is we could call it the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And what Marx talks about is the creation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that's why they're there to oppress all other classes, mainly the upper classes, because the peasantry through industrialization will become the working class. And this isn't like they're not going to go physically like attack the bourgeoisie or anything. The idea is to use the same mechanisms which the bourgeoisie uses in our society to keep the working class down. The police. Why do you think they kill black people and they send black and Hispanics to prisons to work for cheap? It's economically beneficial for them and everything like that. They use these mechanisms and everything to make it physically impossible for there to be a ruling class. So there is only a working class. So we could talk about how it's not democratic, but compared to the Tsar, it's the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party. You could be born a peasant, and you could work your way up to the top of it. But there's democratic centralism and all these other things involved with it. But we don't want to try to frame it we don't want to. We have to watch out, or we'll end up falling into the way that capitalist America has framed the argument, which is kind of propagandic.
I mean, in other words, democracy can encompass a variety of political forms, and we tend to think of it as one very specific political form, which is the one we have now, representative electoral democracy. But sort of what you were raising is a question, I mean, you brought up the Cuban example, which is a perfect example. You don't vote for president of Cuba, but at the same time, is it not more democratic to be able to receive medical attention when you need it? Is that not some level of democratization? I'm not saying one against the other should be pitted as a good or awful example, but that these things do inhabit areas of extreme contradiction and complication.
I think we need to wrap up. It's almost 10 to 6. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Amazing.
So Nathan, thank you very much.